Stephen had always prided himself on being an observant husband. He knew Linda better than anyone, or at least, he thought he did. Their marriage had always been one of those solid, dependable unions built on years of shared experiences, mutual respect, and deep affection. They had met in college, and from the moment they locked eyes at that crowded campus party, something clicked. Linda was the life of the party, with her infectious laughter and bright eyes, while Stephen was more reserved, preferring to observe from the sidelines. It was their differences that had drawn them together, and for years, they complemented each other perfectly. But over the past few months, something had changed. It was subtle at first, so subtle that Stephen dismissed it as a figment of his imagination. Linda had recently started a new job as an event planner, a role that suited her outgoing personality perfectly. She was good at it too, excelling quickly and earning the praise of her colleagues. The job, however, came with a demanding schedule, late-night meetings, weekend events, and constant phone calls. Stephen, supportive as ever, understood the demands of her profession. He was proud of her success, happy to see her thriving in a career she loved. However, as time passed, Stephen began to notice small changes in Linda's behavior. She started spending more time on her phone, often texting late into the night, even when they were supposed to be having their quiet, personal time together. She would excuse herself to take calls in another room, something she never used to do. At first, Stephen brushed it off. It was just work, he told himself. She had a lot on her plate, and the job was new. Of course, she would need time to adjust. But the changes didn't stop there. Linda's appearance began to shift as well. She started wearing a new perfume, something floral and heady, a scent he didn't recognize. She would dress up more often, even on days when she didn't have any major events to attend. She seemed more concerned with her appearance than usual, spending extra time in front of the mirror, fussing over her hair, her makeup, her clothes. Stephen noticed, but he didn't comment. He wanted to be supportive, not accusatory. Yet, the changes continued to pile up. The intimate moments they once shared became fewer and further between. Their conversations were stilted, filled with awkward silences that neither knew how to fill. When they did talk, it was often about mundane things, the weather, work, the latest Netflix series. Gone were the deep, meaningful conversations they used to have, the ones where they would stay up late, discussing their dreams and fears. Instead, there was a distance between them, one that Stephen couldn't quite bridge. It wasn't just the physical distance that concerned him, but the emotional one as well. Linda had always been his confidant, his partner in everything, but now, she seemed like a stranger. She was often preoccupied, lost in her thoughts, and when Stephen would ask her what was wrong, she would just smile and say she was tired. Tired. It had become her go-to excuse for everything, and Stephen, not wanting to push her, let it slide. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Stephen's unease grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that something was wrong. His instincts, the ones that had served him well in both his personal and professional life, were screaming at him, but he didn't want to believe them. He didn't want to believe that the woman he loved, the woman he had vowed to spend the rest of his life with, could be hiding something from him. One evening, while Linda was out at yet another business dinner, Stephen found himself alone in their living room. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making you hyper-aware of every sound, every creak of the floorboards. Stephen poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as he tried to focus on the television. But the show, a mindless sitcom, barely registered. His mind was elsewhere, fixated on Linda's recent behavior. He couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that something wasn't right. His thoughts raced, going over every interaction they had had in the past few months, every time she had brushed him off, every excuse she had given. It was like a puzzle, and the pieces weren't fitting together the way they should. Determined to find out the truth, Stephen decided to investigate. He felt a pang of guilt as he picked up Linda's phone, which he had left charging on the kitchen counter. They had always respected each other's privacy, never snooping, never prying. But this was different. This was about his marriage, his life. He needed to know. He opened her phone, his heart pounding in his chest. He told himself it was just a quick look, just to put his mind at ease. But what he found only confirmed his worst fears. The call log showed frequent calls to a number he didn't recognize, at odd hours, often late at night. His hands trembled as he scrolled through her messages, finding a series of texts between Linda and the same number. The conversation was casual at first, but as he scrolled further back, the tone changed. The messages became more intimate, more flirtatious. And then there was the name attached to the number. Timothy. Timothy. The name sent a shock of recognition through him. Timothy was the groom's brother, a man they both knew well. He had always been charming, the kind of man who could win anyone over with a smile. Stephen had never considered him a threat, never imagined that he could be anything more than a friend. But now, as he stared at the messages on Linda's phone, everything clicked into place. The late nights, the secrecy, the distance between them, it all made sense now. Stephen felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him, as if the life he had known had been upended in an instant. His stomach churned with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. How could she do this to him? How could she betray him with someone they both knew, someone they both trusted? For days after his discovery, Stephen walked around in a daze. He couldn't focus on his work, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The betrayal consumed him, eating away at his sanity. He replayed the messages over and over in his mind, each word a dagger to his heart. He didn't know how to confront Linda, didn't know if he even wanted to. Part of him wanted to pretend he hadn't seen anything, to go on living in blissful ignorance. But he knew he couldn't. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. Stephen's mind raced as he tried to figure out his next move. Should he confront Linda? Should he confront Timothy? The thought of facing either of them filled him with dread, but he knew he had to do something. He couldn't let this go, couldn't let them get away with it. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Linda had shared a part of herself with Timothy that she had once shared with Stephen. That realization hurt more than anything. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted with his heart, had given herself to someone else. The intimacy they once shared was now tainted, and Stephen knew that no matter what happened, their marriage would never be the same. In the end, Stephen made a decision. He would confront Linda, but not yet. He needed time to plan, to think about what he wanted to say, what he wanted to do. He wouldn't rush into this. He would take his time, make sure he was prepared, because when the time came, he would make sure they both paid for what they had done. As Stephen went through the motions of daily life, he maintained a facade of normalcy. He woke up each morning, kissed Linda on the cheek, and went about his day as if nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. Every time he saw Linda texting or stepping out to take a phone call, his blood boiled. But he kept his emotions in check, knowing that the time for action would come soon enough. Linda, oblivious to the storm gathering around her, continued her affair with Timothy, confident that she had successfully kept Stephen in the dark. She was careful, or so she thought, to hide her tracks, to maintain the illusion of a happy marriage. She had no idea that Stephen was aware of her deception, that he was silently observing her every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Stephen's resolve grew stronger with each passing day. The more he thought about Linda's betrayal, the more determined he became to expose her for what she was. But he wasn't content with a private confrontation. That would be too easy, too discreet. No, Stephen wanted to make sure that Linda and Timothy paid the price for their actions in the most public way possible. He wanted to strip away their pretenses, to humiliate them in front of everyone they knew. The opportunity presented itself in the form of a wedding invitation a month ago. Timothy's brother, Jason, was getting married, and the event promised to be a grand affair. Hundreds of guests were invited, including many of Stephen and Linda's mutual friends. It was the perfect setting for the confrontation Stephen had been planning in his mind. Stephen began to visualize how the scene would unfold. He pictured the guests, dressed in their finest, gathered to celebrate the happy couple. He imagined the look of shock on their faces when he took the microphone and dropped the bombshell. And most of all, he imagined the expression on Linda's face when she realized that her secret was out, that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. But Stephen knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, people he could trust to help him pull off his plan. The first person he turned to was Brenda, his best friend and confidant. Brenda had been like a sister to him for years, and she had always been there for him in times of need. When Stephen finally confided in her about Linda's affair, she was devastated for him. Brenda had always suspected something was off, but hearing the confirmation from Stephen was a blow. "I can't believe she would do this to you," Brenda said, her voice thick with emotion as they sat in Stephen's living room, a bottle of wine between them. "You deserve so much better." "I never saw it coming," Stephen replied, his tone flat, as if he were discussing someone else's life. "I thought we were happy. I thought she loved me." "She doesn't deserve you, Stephen," Brenda said, her hand resting on his. "Whatever you decide to do, I'm here for you." Stephen nodded, grateful for her support. He knew he could count on Brenda to stand by him, no matter what. Over the next few days, they spent hours discussing how to approach the situation. Brenda, ever the practical one, suggested confronting Linda privately, but Stephen dismissed the idea. "No," he said firmly. "This isn't just about me. It's about showing everyone who they really are. They need to be exposed, and it has to be public." Brenda hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea, but she eventually agreed. "If that's what you want, then I'll help you. Just promise me you'll be careful. This could get ugly." Stephen promised, though he knew there was no way to avoid the ugliness of what was to come. His plan was simple, but devastating in its execution. He would wait until the perfect moment, during the bride and groom's first dance. It was a time when all eyes would be on the couple, when the room would be filled with joy and celebration. And that's when he would take the microphone and reveal the truth. He envisioned the scene in his mind, over and over, fine-tuning the details. He pictured the stunned silence that would follow his announcement, the whispers that would ripple through the crowd, and the looks of disbelief and horror on Linda and Timothy's faces. He knew it would be brutal, but that was the point. They had taken something precious from him, and now it was his turn to take something from them. As the day of the wedding approached, Stephen's anticipation grew. He was nervous, of course, but more than that, he was resolute. He knew that once he set this plan in motion, there would be no turning back. But he didn't care. He was prepared to burn it all down, to watch as the facade of their lives went up in flames. On the morning of the wedding, Stephen woke up early, his mind clear and focused. He dressed carefully, choosing a suit that was both understated and sharp. He wanted to look composed, in control. Linda, as usual, was preoccupied with her appearance, spending hours getting ready. Stephen watched her out of the corner of his eye, feeling a strange mix of detachment and anticipation. She had no idea what was coming, and he intended to keep it that way until the very last moment. As they left the house and headed to the venue, Stephen felt a sense of calm settle over him. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. And as they walked into the beautifully decorated hall, greeted by friends and acquaintances, Stephen knew that by the end of the night, everything would be different. For better or worse, he was about to change their lives forever. The wedding dawned bright and clear, a perfect late summer day with just a hint of a cool breeze to temper the warmth of the sun. The estate chosen for the event was breathtaking. An expansive property surrounded by manicured gardens, with a grand, historic mansion at its heart. Stephen and Linda arrived together, as they always did. To the casual observer, they appeared to be the perfect couple, Stephen, tall and composed in his tailored suit, and Linda, radiant in a soft pink dress that flattered her figure and brought out the sparkle in her eyes. She had spent the morning fussing over her appearance, ensuring every strand of hair was in place, her makeup flawless. To Stephen, it was all part of the illusion she was trying so desperately to maintain. As they stepped out of the car and into the venue, Linda immediately fell into conversation with a group of friends. She was animated, laughing, and chatting as if she didn't have a care in the world. Stephen, on the other hand, was more reserved, his thoughts elsewhere. The events of the past few months played over and over in his mind like a broken record. He had spent the morning rehearsing his speech, running through the words he would say when the time came. He needed to be sure, to get every word right. This was his moment, and he couldn't afford to falter. The ceremony itself was stunning. Jason, the groom, stood at the altar with an expression of pure joy, his eyes fixed on his bride as she walked down the aisle. The vows they exchanged were heartfelt, filled with promises of love and loyalty that resonated deeply with the guests. Stephen watched it all with a calm, almost detached demeanor, though a part of him couldn't help but feel a pang of irony at the situation. As he sat beside Linda, her hand resting lightly on his arm, he wondered how many of the promises being made today would be broken. Stephen's gaze flickered to Timothy, who was standing beside his brother as the best man. Timothy was all smiles, playing the role of the devoted sibling with ease. He laughed at the appropriate moments, teared up at others, and generally basked in the glow of the occasion. It took every ounce of Stephen's self-control not to confront him then and there. The thought of exposing Timothy in the middle of such a sacred moment crossed his mind more than once, but he knew that patience would pay off. He had a plan, and he needed to stick to it. As the ceremony drew to a close, the guests began to move toward the reception area. The atmosphere was lively, the sound of clinking glasses and laughter filling the air as people mingled and celebrated. Stephen moved through the crowd like a man on autopilot, exchanging pleasantries and making small talk, all the while keeping a close eye on Linda and Timothy. He could feel the tension building within him, like a coiled spring ready to snap. But outwardly, he remained calm, his composure never wavering. Dinner was a lavish affair, with course after course of gourmet dishes served to the delighted guests. Stephen barely touched his food, pushing it around his plate as he waited for the moment he had been anticipating for weeks. Linda was seated a few tables away, engrossed in conversation with a group of friends. Every now and then, Stephen would catch her glancing at Timothy, their eyes meeting briefly before she looked away. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to stoke the fire burning within him. Finally, the time came for the bride and groom's first dance. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd as Jason and his bride took to the floor. They moved gracefully, lost in each other's embrace as the soft strains of a romantic ballad filled the room. Stephen watched them for a moment, taking in the scene. This was it, the perfect moment. Stephen rose from his seat, his movements deliberate, almost slow motion in his mind. He made his way toward the stage where the microphone was set up, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark, save for the spotlight on the dancing couple, and no one noticed him at first. He saw Timothy standing off to the side, a smug smile playing on his lips as he watched his brother and the bride dance. Linda was nearby, her eyes fixed on the couple, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. As the song drew to a close, and the dance ended with a round of applause from the guests, Stephen stepped up to the microphone. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the culmination of weeks of planning, of sleepless nights and endless rehearsals. His hand tightened around the microphone, steadying himself as he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," Stephen's voice rang out clearly, cutting through the applause. The room fell silent almost instantly, and all eyes turned to him. "I hope you're all having a wonderful evening," he continued, his tone polite, almost casual. But there was an edge to it, a sharpness that hinted at what was to come. "I'd like to take a moment to make an announcement," Stephen said, pausing for effect. He scanned the room, his gaze locking onto Linda, who was now looking at him with confusion, her brows furrowed in concern. She had no idea what was coming. "I want to congratulate my wife, Linda," he said, his voice turning icy, "for managing to have an affair with the groom's brother, Timothy, without anyone noticing." The words hung in the air like a bombshell, detonating the carefully curated atmosphere of the evening. Gasps echoed through the room, followed by a wave of shocked whispers. The crowd was stunned, their expressions ranging from disbelief to horror. Stephen could see the color drain from Linda's face as the full weight of his words hit her. Her mouth opened as if to say something, but no sound came out. She was frozen, paralyzed by the sudden and brutal exposure of her betrayal. Timothy, who had been leaning casually against the bar, turned bright red, his expression shifting from smugness to sheer panic. He looked around, as if searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The crowd's attention was fully on him now, their eyes boring into him with judgment and disgust. Stephen stood there, watching the scene unfold, feeling a sense of grim satisfaction. He had done it. He had pulled the rug out from under them, shattered their illusions, and expose them for what they really were. The room was in chaos now, with guests whispering and pointing, some trying to comfort the bride and groom, who were now caught in the crossfire of a scandal that wasn't theirs to bear. Linda's body reacted before her mind could catch up. She spun on her heels, her one thought being escape. She needed to get out of that room, away from the stares, the whispers, and most of all, away from Stephen. But as she made a desperate dash for the door, Stephen was already there, blocking her path with a steely resolve that sent a chill down her spine. "Where do you think you're going, bitch?" he asked, his voice low, filled with the anger he had kept bottled up for so long. Linda looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear, tears spilling down her cheeks. She opened her mouth to plead, to apologize, but Stephen wasn't interested in hearing it. He had said his piece, delivered his revenge, and now there was nothing left to say. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. There was a menace in his tone that she had never heard before, a finality that made her knees weak. Linda looked up at him, her eyes wide, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had never seen him like this, so cold, so impenetrable. Panic surged through her. "Stephen, please, I want to explain," she pleaded, her voice trembling as she reached out to him, but he recoiled from her touch as if she were a venomous snake. "Explain?" Stephen's voice dripped with sarcasm, his anger finally breaking through the composure he had held onto so tightly. "There's nothing to explain, Linda. You betrayed me, and now everyone knows what you are." His words were sharp, each one cutting into her like a blade. Linda winced, feeling the sting of his words as they echoed in the silent room. Around them, the guests had formed a loose circle, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Shock, pity, and a morbid curiosity painted their faces as they watched the confrontation. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the rawness of the scene, while others leaned in, captivated by the spectacle. Linda could feel their eyes on her, judging, condemning, and it made her skin crawl. Across the room, Timothy had tried to slip away, to fade into the background and escape the growing tension. But Stephen's friends, who had been waiting for their moment, intercepted him. They flanked him, cutting off his retreat, their faces hard with a mixture of anger and disgust. Timothy, usually so confident and charming, was reduced to a nervous wreck, his face pale, his eyes darting around for an exit that didn't exist. "You thought you could do this behind my back, didn't you?" Stephen's voice rose, filling the room with the fury he had kept hidden for so long. "You thought you could make a fool of me and get away with it. Well, guess what? The whole world knows now." He gestured to the crowd, his eyes blazing. Linda looked around, feeling the weight of their stares, the crushing reality of her situation bearing down on her. There was no way out, no escape from the consequences of her actions. Tears streamed down her face, blurring her vision. She tried to speak, to find some way to make him understand, but the words caught in her throat. She was trapped, cornered, with nothing left to say. "Stephen, I'm sorry," she finally choked out, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I never meant to hurt you." "Sorry?" Stephen let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and devoid of humor. "You're only sorry because you got caught. If I hadn't found out, you'd still be sneaking around with him, wouldn't you?" He didn't wait for her to respond. He didn't need to. The truth was written all over her face, in the guilt that she couldn't hide. Linda opened her mouth to protest, to say something, anything, that might salvage what was left of their marriage, but Stephen cut her off, his voice as sharp as a knife. "Save it, Linda. We're done. I'll be filing for divorce first thing Monday morning. You can go and be with Timothy if he still wants you after this." His words were like a death sentence, final and irreversible. Linda's legs gave out beneath her, and she sank to the floor, sobbing. At that moment, Jason, the groom, who had been standing frozen in shock, finally snapped out of his stupor. His face was a mask of disbelief and fury as he turned to his brother. "Timothy, how could you do this?" he demanded, his voice shaking with emotion. "You've ruined everything. On my wedding day, no less." His words were thick with hurt, the betrayal cutting deep. "Timothy, still reeling from the public humiliation, tried to stammer out an apology, his voice cracking under the pressure. But Jason wasn't interested in apologies. "You're no brother of mine," he said coldly, his eyes narrowing with disgust. "You've betrayed all of us. You've torn this family apart." The tension in the room was unbearable, a suffocating weight that pressed down on everyone present. The guests looked on, unsure whether to intervene or leave, their discomfort palpable. Stephen knew it was time to go. There was nothing left for him here, nothing but the shattered remains of his marriage and the lingering anger that clung to the air like smoke. He turned to the crowd, forcing a brief, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry to have ruined your evening," he said, his voice quiet but steady. But the truth had to come out. His words were met with stunned silence, the guests too shocked to respond. With that, Stephen walked out of the room, the tension easing slightly as he left. Behind him, Linda and Timothy were left to face the fallout of their actions, the weight of their choices crushing down on them. As he stepped out into the cool night air, Stephen felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a lingering sense of betrayal. But above all, he felt a sense of finality. The truth was out, and now there was no turning back. In the days following the wedding, Stephen's life took a sharp turn. The story of the public confrontation at Jason's wedding spread like wildfire, turning him into an unwitting center of attention. Friends and acquaintances whispered about the scandal, and soon everyone knew the details of what had happened. Linda made several attempts to reach out, sending long, desperate messages filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. Stephen, resolute in his decision, deleted them all without reading and eventually blocked her number. There was no turning back. The divorce proceedings were swift, as Stephen wanted to move on as quickly as possible. Linda, her spirit crushed by the public humiliation and the loss of her social standing, didn't contest it. She moved out of their shared home and retreated to her parents' house, where she was met with cold disappointment. Her parents, ashamed and dismayed by her actions, offered little comfort. Timothy, too, faced his own set of consequences. Disowned by his family, his once carefree life was now marred by the disgrace of his betrayal. Stephen, determined not to dwell on the past, threw himself into his work. His architectural projects became both an escape and a source of fulfillment. The creativity and focus required helped him regain a sense of control over his life. Brenda, his best friend, remained a constant presence, offering her unwavering support. She encouraged him to seek therapy, knowing that he needed to process the emotional trauma. Therapy proved to be a turning point for Stephen. It wasn't easy to confront his pain, but it allowed him to heal, slowly but surely. He began to rediscover parts of himself that had been buried under the weight of betrayal. He reconnected with old friends, attended social events, and started to enjoy life again. A few months later, at a charity event, Stephen met Laura. She was intelligent, kind, and had a warmth that immediately drew him in. As they chatted, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a flicker of hope. They exchanged numbers, and as they parted ways, Laura smiled and said, "I'd love to see you again, Stephen." Stephen smiled back, a genuine smile that reflected the optimism growing inside him. "I'd like that too," he replied. Walking away, Stephen felt lighter. The past few months had been some of the most challenging of his life, but they had also been a time of profound growth. He had faced betrayal and emerged stronger, more resilient. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Stephen felt ready to embrace it. He had closed the chapter on his old life and was ready to start a new one.